All right, in today's video, we're going to be answering a lot of really important questions. The first one is, what is SSDLC and what are the different levels and what are the different pieces of SSDLC? And then how do you implement the different parts of SSDLC? It's such a tongue twister to say. And then what is a risk assessment, right? What are the different pieces that go into a risk assessment? What is a threat model? How do you do threat modeling? What's the purpose of threat modeling? What is secure coding? What are the different steps of ensuring that the code of a software is actually secure? What are security assessments? How do you run security assessments? What are the different steps of a security assessment? And what are the various SSDLC methodologies? I almost want to give it away, but I can't because then it would give away everything else in the video. So, and finally, the last piece of it is that we're going to play a nice little game. And I'm gonna open this up and I'm gonna close it real quick because I don't want you to see the flag right there. But we get to play a game where it's like an old school arcade game and we control this rocket that goes through space and we have to choose the different steps that we're going through just so we can get the flag at the very end. And this is what we're gonna be talking about in today's video. So SSDLC, let's talk about it and let's see what we can learn today. All right, the Secure Software Development Lifecycle, SSDLC, is a development lifecycle. It's a testing lifecycle that was done to, go through debugging, making sure you find all the flaws, all vulnerabilities, and everything that usually is discovered late in the game, making it much more expensive and time-consuming to fix those things. So if you can do it during the development of the software, then you're going to end up saving a lot of time, energy, and money. In a lot of cases, security testing wasn't considered during the testing phase, so the end users would end up reporting bugs after the deployment of the software itself. And so the SSDLC, the Secure Software Development Lifecycle, aims to introduce security at every stage of the software development lifecycle. So the reason why it's so important is the relative cost of everything, right? So if we were to look at this graph that we have here, it says the relative cost of fixing defects during the design phase is 1, and I think it's 1 time. So like 1x essentially. So during the design phase, if you wanted to fix it, it's 1x the cost. During the implementation phase, it's 6.5 times the cost. During the testing phase, it's 15 times the cost. And then during the maintenance phase is 100 times the cost, which essentially means it's actually running. So if it's in the maintenance phase, it's actually running and operating. And so it's 100 times more expensive to fix something while it's running versus with the 15 times more expensive during the testing phase. Maybe we can kind of zoom in on this and make it a little bit bigger. It's 100 times more expensive to do it during maintenance and operation versus 15 times more expensive during testing, and then literally it's just 1 time as expensive when you do it during the design phase. So it's pretty important. This is a pretty important concept to wrap our heads around. And you may not necessarily want to be a software developer, but you do need to understand how to fix software in the design and implementation and testing phases because of security flaws, specifically security vulnerabilities and things like that. And this is where we come in. You have to go and partner up with the development team to help them approach the design and implementation and testing phases according to the best security practices. So apart from faster development and low costs, integrating security across the software development lifecycle helps discover and reduce vulnerabilities early on, which reduces the business risk massively. And introducing security at all stages could be architecture analysis during the design, it could be code review and scanners during the development stage, and conducting security assessments, which is penetration testing, before the actual deployment of it. So in a waterfall model, this type of testing is carried out at the end of the life cycle, right before production. And in an agile model, we can implement secure by design, meaning during the design phase, you can start implementing security principles. So if the pen test results in errors like an SQL injection in the waterfall scenario, mitigating the bugs would entail doing another cycle to fix the bug, meaning you got to go from the top again and redo everything. So it requires redesigning, applying the changes, and retesting, and making sure that it's actually been remediated. In the agile model, discussions on whether to prevent flaws such as parameterization during the planning phase can avoid having to roll back and go back to the beginning and then start everything all over again. So agile seems to be the best approach to software development security. So the summary is that it's a constant concern. Security is improving software quality and security constantly. Boosting education and awareness is important. Everybody needs to know each phases of the security recommendations and requirements. Flaws are detected early before deployment, reducing the risk. Costs are reduced and speed increases if there is early detection, right? So if there is early detection and resolution, then cost is reduced and speed increases and business risk is reduced. Brand reputation is maintained and there is less damage to it, and fines and punishments and all these things could all be prevented as a result. So the question here is, how much more does it cost to identify vulnerabilities during the testing phase? And we saw over here that it's 15 times more expensive to do it during the testing phase. So that is just an introduction to the secure software development lifecycle room that we're in right now, so that we can actually jump into the implementation of it and everything else. So let's talk about implementing SSDLC. All right, the big part to implementing SSDLC is to understand your security posture. And the first thing that you have to do that is to perform a gap analysis that determines what policies and activities exist in your company and how effective they actually are, and if there's any gaps in between your policies and procedures, and how to fill, what needs to be done to fill in those gaps. So for example, ensuring policies are in place, meaning what the team does, with security procedures, which means how the team executes those specific policies. Then you would create a software security initiative by establishing realistic and achievable goals with specific metrics for success. So you got to measure the actual practical things that somebody can do to make sure that you achieve those goals. And the example of this would be a secure coding standard, playbooks for handling data, and tracking the project management tools or tracking those specific steps using project management tools. And you want to formalize the process. After starting a program, it's essential to spend an operational period helping engineers get familiarized with it and gather feedback before enforcing it. And then when you do a gap analysis, every policy should have defined procedures to make them effective. So when it becomes formal, it means that it's kind of becoming set in stone, and it is now the new procedure that you're going to be implementing from now on. And then you would invest in security training for the engineers, as well as any appropriate tools that would be applied to that, and making sure that people are actually aware of the processes and the tools that will come with those processes to make it operational, and invest in training early on before establishing and onboarding the actual tool that's going to be used. And these are just a few steps in understanding the overall security posture of the company that you're in. And then once you have that, you can look at the overall secure development lifecycle, which is what we're looking at here, right? So this is a big image, and we're going to be referring to this process a lot through the rest of this room, which kind of pretty much just covers like the step-by-step of what's going to be done and how it's going to be done. So during the risk assessment phase, risk assessment is done during the planning phase, and then there's another risk assessment that's done during the defining of the requirements, and then you have threat modeling that's done during the design and prototyping phase, and then you have code scanning and code review that's done during the software development phase, code scanning and review again that's done during the testing of the software. Then you have the secure configuration that's done during deployment, and then security assessments that are done during the operational and maintenance phase of the software development lifecycle. And if we were to look at this and get a little bit more information, because this is important, I really want you to kind of grab this and wrap your head around it. So during risk assessment, which is during the early stages of software development lifecycle, it is essential to identify security considerations that promote a security by design approach when functional requirements are gathered in the planning and requirements stages. So for example, if a user requests a blog entry from a website, the user should not be able to edit the blog or remove unnecessary input from those fields. So this is a risk assessment. This is the risk assessment phase that's done during it's a risk assessment activity that's done during the early stages of SDLC, which is the planning and the defining of the requirements. Then you do threat modeling, and we did a video on threat modeling, so you should go check that out if you haven't seen it already. And threat modeling is the process of identifying potential threats when there's a lack of appropriate safeguards. So if there is not enough safeguards or no safeguards, then you need to be able to identify the threats that are going to happen by modeling what an attacker would do. And it's very effective when following a risk assessment. And during the design stage of SDLC, a threat modeling focuses on what should not happen. And in the opposite of that, in contrast to that, design requirements state how the software would behave and interact. So, for example, ensuring that there's a verification when a user requests their account information. So verifying that the user is who they are. And that's just a simple thing that we do all the time when we're checking our accounts, bank accounts or anything like that. But you don't really think about what had to be done to test those things. And in the last video, we talked about what happened to LinkedIn and Twitter, where they were attacked and information about accounts was released. And these are things that you don't really think about unless you're a security engineer, especially if you're a software developer. Like software developers, I'm sure they have an idea of making sure security is a priority, but they don't see the things that we see. They don't have the perspectives that we do as ethical hackers and penetration testers. So it's important to understand that you need to go into all of these processes with a very, very critical mindset and threat model, or model any kind of threats that could be potential against your specific endpoints or softwares that you're dealing with. So code scanning and review. So code reviews can either be manual or automated. Code scanning or automated code reviews can leverage static and dynamic security testing. Static means that it's just happening while it's sitting there at rest. Dynamic security testing is done while it's running. And these are crucial in the development stages as code is being written. So you look at the code while it's just sitting there, and that would be static code standing. And then you run the code, and then you look at how it performs and how it runs. And during that phase, that would be a dynamic security test that you're looking at what potential vulnerabilities exist. And then you have security assessments. So penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, they're a form of automated testing that can identify critical paths of an application that may lead to exploitation of a vulnerability. These are hypothetical, as the assessment doesn't carry simulations of those attacks. So pen testing, on the other hand, identifies these flaws and attempts to exploit them to demonstrate the validity, the validness, I don't think validness is a word, but the validity of those vulnerabilities. And pen tests and vulnerability assessments are carried out during the operations and maintenance phase of SDLC after a prototype of the application is released. So these are the methodologies that apply to the processes that we're going to be doing in task 5, and it'll help us navigate and understand what we're doing when introducing risk assessment, threat modeling, scanning, and testing and operational assurance. So we're going to be looking at a lot of these things in detail in the next few minutes. So the first question here is, what should you understand before implementing secure software development lifecycle processes? And that is the security posture of the company. And then during which stage would you perform a risk assessment? And it's done during the planning and requirement phases, the early phases of the software development lifecycle, the planning and requirement phases. And then what should be carried out during the design phase? And during the design phase, we're going to be doing threat modeling. So these are some of the questions to just confirm that we wrapped our head around this information. And so now we're going to jump into a risk assessment. What is a risk assessment? And let's see what we can learn here. All right, a risk assessment answers a really big and important question. It's what's the likelihood of a threat being exploited? What's the likelihood of the impact and the possibility, and how much could it actually affect that resource or the target that is going to be attacked? So you're assessing the risk that's available. So if a vulnerability exploited after a new version of the software is published, or design flaws and poorly reviewed code can increase the risk of these scenarios. So if you publish something new and there is a design flaw in it, or the code wasn't reviewed properly, then the risk is very high in that situation, and that can actually be exploited. So risk management is an important pillar to integrate into software development lifecycle to mitigate risk in a product or service. And when you are doing an assessment, it's very similar to a vulnerability assessment. You're looking at what kind of risk is available in this particular case. How likely is it that we're going to be attacked? That's essentially what that means. So it's used to determine the level of a potential threat, and identifying any risks in that process can be reduced or eliminated by applying appropriate controls during the mitigation process, the risk mitigation process. And usually a risk assessment is followed by threat modeling, which will be explained in our next section. So when you do a risk assessment, the first step is to assume that the software is going to be attacked, and then consider the factors that motivate the attacker. So assume that there is actually going to be an attack. Don't even think that there might not be an attack. There's definitely going to be an attack. And so what would be the factors that would determine what the attack is in that case? So, do you have bank accounts, and would somebody want to transfer money out of those bank accounts? Do you have sensitive data about your intellectual property, and would somebody want to steal your data and use your intellectual property or sell your intellectual property? So what would be the motives behind the attack that would be done against your system, depending on what the process or the function of your system is? And then you would list out the factors such as the data value of the program, the security level of the companies who provides the resources that your code depends on if you're using a third-party company, the client's purchasing software, how big is the software distributed? So is it a single, a small work group? Is it a worldwide release? And then based on these things, you write down the acceptable level of the risk. So a data loss may cause the company to lose millions, especially if they require to pay fines with the General Data Protection Regulation by eliminating all the potential security bugs in a code, and it can cost $40,000. So the company and some other stakeholders have decided that if it's worth it or not, and you got to communicate those trade-offs. So if you wanted to fix whatever the vulnerability is that would cause data loss, it would cost $40,000. Is it worth it to spend the $40,000 to fix that thing? Because if you lose the data, or if something happens and there is a privacy issue, you can get fined and you can get sued by your customers for a class action lawsuit, and it can cost a lot more than $40,000. So everyone needs to understand what the risk is and what the implications of that risk are, what the costs are. And then from the perspective of brand reputation, if it causes damage to the company's image or their reputation, it costs the company more in the long run than spending this little $40,000 to fix the code. So it's very, very important to understand the trade-offs, right? So is it $40,000? It's a lot of money, sure, but compared to millions of dollars, right? In the last video, we talked about how much money Microsoft makes in a day, and they make $100 million in a day. So if there was a glitch in their software and it cost them $40,000 to fix it, would it be worth it? Yeah, absolutely. So these are some of the things that you look at when you're doing a risk assessment, right? So the first step is to understand that you're going to be attacked, and then what the motivations of the attack are, and then what is going to be the cost to the company if something like that happens. Then you evaluate the risk. So the next step is to evaluate that risk, like the worst case scenario of what happens. So if they actually do get in and they they get into your system and get your data, what is the possible, like the worst possible case scenario that could actually happen? And then you would do this by doing a ransomware attack. That could be one simulation that would give you an idea of what the worst case scenario is. And so what's the value of the data that's being stolen? The user's identity, could credentials to gain control of endpoints on your network, or assets and data that pose lower risk, any of those things. Another factor would be to consider the difficulty of a successful attack. If it's easy to attack you, then it's probably really important to fix this. If it's easy to attack you and the data that's at risk is really sensitive, you have to fix it. If it's complicated to attack you and the data is super low value, maybe it's not that big of a deal. But if the data is really big, if its data is really valuable and it's easy to attack you, then you really need to fix that. So if an attacker can gain access to your company's tool for giving feedback to colleagues or running retrospective meetings, it would have a low impact than assessing the product environment monitoring and alert systems, right? So if the monitoring and alert systems in your environment are at risk and they're about to be attacked, that is much more critical than the tool that you use to give feedback to your employees. You know what I'm saying? So the high level of risk is not acceptable, and it's best to mitigate it immediately. So a vulnerability that can be exploited by anyone running a pre-written attack script or using botnets to spread scripts to compromise the network, those things need to be fixed immediately. Users affected are a vital factor. So who your company's users being affected, your customers being affected, all of these things are very, very important to consider. And then we have the third step. So some attacks only affect one or two users, but a denial of service attack affects thousands of users. Going back to the Microsoft example, they make $100 million a day. If their website is down, if a denial of service attack is successful against Microsoft, and every day that website is down, it's $100 million that they're losing. A week goes by, that's $700 million that is just lost. That's pretty crazy when you think about it. So thousands of computers may be infected by a spread of worms. The last factor is the accessibility of the target. So if the target accepts requests across a network, or if it accepts local requests, whether the authentication is needed for the connection, or if anybody can do it. These are all variables to consider, and it'll have more of an impact if the attacker accesses a production environment versus a sandbox environment, which is a controlled environment in a local playground that you can't really do much outside of that sandbox. So these are all variables to consider when you are doing a risk assessment, right? So what's going to be the cost to fix it? What is the actual motivation of the attacker? And then you have the worst case scenario of what is actually at risk here. How easy is it to access those things? How complex would the attacker how complex of an attack would they need to run? And then if they do get into your system, what is the actual damage that they can cause? And then who is actually affected? So the users that are affected, is it just going to be one or two users, or would it be thousands of users, millions of users who are affected if something happens? And all of these things are different variables to consider for doing a risk assessment. So you have two general types of risk assessments. You have a qualitative risk assessment and you have a quantitative risk assessment. The most common type is qualitative. And qualitative is when you assess and classify a risk into thresholds like low, medium, and high. And systematically, you examine what can cause the harm, meaning you have some kind of a checklist or some kind of a list of parameters that you use to examine what can cause the harm and what decisions should be made to define or improve control measures. And then all types of risk assessment, there's some kind of a priority level. So high is the most urgent and low is the least urgent. So even though there are no actual numbers associated with this, the formula is very, very simple. The risk itself, the severity of the risk, if it's high, low, medium, the risk itself equals the severity, which is either high, low, or medium, times the likelihood. So how likely is it? How probable is it that we're going to get attacked? And then if we do get attacked, how bad is it? So That's essentially what you're looking at. How probable, how likely is it that we're going to get attacked? And if we do get attacked, how bad will the damage be? And what's going to happen to us if this happens? And then when you have an understanding of that, then you would say that this is an important risk, or if it's not. So if it's really likely that you're going to get attacked and it's really high severity, it's very severe what would happen to you, that's something that you need to address right away. If it's not likely, or very, very low likelihood that you're going to get attacked and the severity is low, then it's something that you can probably, accept that risk, right? It's called risk acceptance. That could be something that you could do. So that's qualitative risk assessment. Quantitative risk assessment is used to measure the risk with actual numbers, right? So instead of low, medium, and high, you would actually have numbers that represent what happens in these different categories. And then when you carry out a quantitative risk assessment, when you do something like this, you use tools to determine the severity and likelihood, like a vulnerability scanner, right? It actually gives you, Nessus is like a really popular one. It gives you a quantitative response. It actually is like a combination of quantitative and qualitative. So it'll say, it's high and it's, 8.5 severity kind of a thing. So if, as an example, if we were to use a service with assigned business criticality levels, right? In that case, you can say that if a bug affects a business critical service, so an authentication service, something that verifies who a person is and gets them to log in. If that authentication service gets hit, or the payment infrastructure, the way that you collect payments or the way that you pay people, if one of those things gets affected, then you assign 5 points to one of those things. And this highlights why it's vital to understand the posture of the company and the processes that they use, right? So if you know what different processes that they use, and then you do your risk assessment and you find out that, oh, this particular thing that we use, our payment collection system, it's at risk, because you know that there's a payment collection system. So when you know these things, you can actually make the proper judgments. And then measuring risk and priority with the endemic equation to accompany services, and it has really amazing results. So this is what that means, right? So this is the likelihood, right? So if it's really, really certain, so let's see if we can make this a little bit bigger. So the likelihood is right here. So at the very, very top, it's very rare, and the severity is insignificant, has very little impact. So it's a level 1, has not a big deal. You could probably even let that go. But if it's really certain, meaning that it's most likely you're going to get attacked, and the severity is death in this case, so it's really freaking bad, then it's a 25 point risk, which means that you need to take care of that right now. So obviously 25 would be the worst score. 20 is the next one. 16 and 15 are pretty serious and you need to address them. And then the ones in the middle right here, you would do, you meet with the stakeholders, you meet with the executives. Well, I mean, with all of them, you meet with the stakeholders and executives, but the way that you present these things will probably be different. And you say, hey, you know what, this is a level 1. It's really honestly not that big of a deal. You could probably even let it go, but if you want to fix it, we could totally fix it. This is a level 25, and if you don't fix this, you are going to die. Your business is going to crash and burn, and it'll be horrible. So you need to put the proper language and proper wording to make sure that they understand that this is a really big deal and it needs to be fixed. So risk assessments are better performed at the beginning of software development lifecycle, during planning and requirement phases. So if a customer data gets exfiltrated by an attack, that could be one thing. Once the system is developed, you can perform quantitative risk analysis. So one customer can sue for $20,000 if the data gets leaked, and we have 100 customers. So the annual rate of the occurrence is 0.001. So the annual loss expectancy would be 20,000 times 100 customers multiplied by 0.001, which makes it $2,000. That's the worth of this specific risk. And so as long as the company's compensating security control costs less than $2,000, then we're not overspending on security, right? If the cost of this was 200 and the cost for the security control was 2,000, then you'd be like, all right, we'll accept that risk. Does that make sense? So this is how you kind of calculate this whole thing. And we also did a video on this to try to calculate the risk of or the calculating the cost of a risk. And it was actually at the beginning of our security engineer pathway. I think it was in the security risk management. That's where it was. So in the risk management video, so if you can go find that on the channel, you'll see that we'll go and do the risk analysis, where it gives us, again, kind of very similar to what we just looked at, and then it gives us a formula to single loss expectancy, the numeric example of it, and how to calculate the numeric example of something like this. So we actually go pretty deep into this formula that we just used right here to get this value, so that you can understand how much something will hurt if it hits the company, and then how to calculate whether or not it's worth it to fix that thing. So the question is, what is a formula to assign a qualitative risk level? The formula to assign a qualitative risk level is this: risk equals severity times likelihood. And I'm just going to paste that. Or actually, I think I just need to do severity times likelihood. So severity times likelihood. And then which type of risk assessment assigns numerical values to determine the risk? And that is quantitative risk assessment. And there we go. We got our risk assessment out of the way. So now let's talk about threat modeling. Modeling threats. All right, threat modeling is best done. So the best time to do threat modeling is before any code is written. So you model all the threats before you actually write the code, so you can write the code with all of the threats in mind. So threat modeling is a structured process to identify potential threats and prioritize the techniques to mitigate those threats, so that data or assets have been classified as valuable or something like that are taken care of and they're protected. When performed early, it brings a great advantage, which means potential issues can be found early and solved, saving the fixing costs down the line. As we established earlier, right? The earlier you do this, the cheaper it is to fix the stuff. So there are a lot of methods to do this, and not all of these methods have the same purpose, and some of them are more customer focused, some of them are focused on risk or privacy for the company. So we can combine all of those things to understand potential threats better, and it's essential to analyze which aligns more with the project or the business that you're in. And these are some of the models right here. You have Stride, Dread, and Pasta. And again, this was something that we actually did inside of this room. I don't know if it was in this room or if it was in the other one, but we definitely did a video on this because I remember those acronyms: Stride, Thread, and Pasta, and all those things. And so if you want to go find them, you can just look for Stride, Dread, or Pasta inside the channel. So if you go, this is our channel right here, and if you click on search right here, and if I just do Pasta as a search, there you go, threat modeling, simulating real attacks, hacks, and security. So there you go, the threat modeling video will show you everything there is to know about those different approaches. So STRIDE stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation or escalation of privilege. It's a widely used threat model developed by Microsoft, which evaluates the system's design in a more detailed view. And we can use this to identify threats, including property violated by the threat and the definition of it. And the system's data flow diagram is going to be developed in this model. So each node is applied with the STRIDE model. Identifying security threats is a manual process that tools are not supported and should be carried out during the risk assessment. Using data flow diagrams and integrating STRIDE, the system entities, attack surfaces like known boundaries and events that become more identifiable. STRIDE stands for spoofing identity, tampering with data, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. And it's built upon the CIA triad, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Security professionals that use STRIDE are looking to answer one question, which is, what could go wrong with the system? So this is what it is, right? So this is the security development lifecycle. So spoofing the identity, implemented in here, tampering with the data, implemented, repudiation, which means can somebody deny that they did this, right? So if they can't deny that they did it, that means you have good repudiation measures in place. But if they can deny it, that means you don't have good repudiation. Repudiation means to deny something. So I didn't do it, and it's like, well, no, we have proof that you did it. We have your username, we have the computer that you used, all that stuff. Disclosing information, which is data exfiltration, data breach, all that. Denial of service, and an elevation of privileges. So we have another rundown of all these things. So spoofing is impersonating a user, which can be done in a lot of different ways, and it goes through the authentication principle from the CIA triad, and it could be ARP poisoning, so the address resolution protocol, the IP poisoning or IP spoofing, ARP spoofing, and of course DNS spoofing. And then tampering means modifying data, and you're looking at the integrity of the data. How strong is the data? How real is the data? And that's the principle of the CIA triad, that tampering deals with. Repudiation, as we just talked about, not taking responsibility for the events. It violates the principle of non-reputability. For example, the attacker clears all the logs that could lead to leaving traces. So you can't say we have evidence that you did this, right? That's for repudiation. So not taking responsibility. Information disclosure, so violating confidentiality, and data breaches is an example. Denial of service, we've talked about this. They can't access the service, so it goes through the availability principle of the CIA triad. And then elevation and escalation of privileges to gain unauthorized access, and it is for part of the authorization principle of the CIA triad. Then we have DREAD, the DREAD model for threat modeling. And there's 5 major questions, and obviously it's the whole acronym thing. Like these are all acronyms, right? So what is the damage potential? What is reproducibility? How easy is it to reproduce this? How easy is it to exploit this thing? Who are the affected users? And how easy is it to discover what's going on? It's also created by Microsoft, and it can be an add-on to the previous thing that we talked about, which is Stride. And it ranks threats by assigning identified threats according to their severity and priority. In other words, it creates a rating system, and it's score-based for the risk probability. So without Stride, DREAD can also be used in assessing and analyzing and finding the probability by the threat. And then these are the breakdowns of it. So damage refers to the possible damage that the threat could do. So it's a scale of 0 to 10. 0 means that there's no damage, 5 means information disclosure, 8 means user data is compromised, 9 is internal or administrative data compromised, and 10 means unavailability of a service. Then reproducibility means the complexity of the attack and how easily an attack can replicate and reproduce that threat. 0 means that it's impossible to copy, 5 means it's complex but possible, 7.5 is an authenticated user can do it, and 10 means the attacker can reproduce very quickly without any kind of authentication. Exploitability refers to the sophistication or how easy it is to attack you. 2.5 implies that it requires an advanced skill set to attack you because it's not very easily exploitable, and that means that they need networking skills, programming skills. 5 means that they can use various tools to do it, and 9 means that they need a very simple web application to do it. 10 means they don't need shit. They can do it through a web browser, and they can do it very easily. Affected users is the number of users that are affected by that vulnerability. So 0 means that there's nobody that's affected by this. 2.5 means an individual user could be affected by this. 6 would mean a small group of new users. 9 would mean significant users like admins. And 10 would mean everybody's affected. And discoverability is discovering the vulnerable points in the system. So how easy it is to find out what your vulnerabilities are. The threat would be easily found in a case of compromise. So 0 means that it's very hard to discover it. 5 means that it can be discovered by analyzing HTTP requests. And 8 means it can be easily found and it's public, that you can find it easily. And 10 would mean it's visible in the address bar, meaning the link up here, it's actually visible. And we talked about this in the last video that we did on the EDOR, right? The identifying the insecure direct object. There you go. Insecure direct objects. That's what EDOR would be. And then we have PASTA, so Process Attack Simulation Threat Analysis. And it's risk-centric. It focuses to align technical requirements with business objectives, and involves the threat modeling process for analyzing threats to finding ways to mitigate them. So everything in between as well. And on a strategic level and the perspective of the attacker is what PASTA kind of looks at. It identifies the threat, enumerates the threat, and then assigns a score to the threat. And it can help anybody, especially the company you work with, you yourself, to find suitable countermeasures to mitigate the threat. And it's divided into 7 stages. So you define the objective, define the technical stage, decompose the application, analyze the threat, find the vulnerabilities and weaknesses, model the attacks, and then risk and impact analysis. So during define objectives, the first stage, you just look at the structure and defining the objectives of the attack. And it makes the end goal a whole lot easier to understand and ensures that the relevant assets are threat modeled. So whatever you need to actually attack, you model your threat around that. And then the defining of the technical scope is where you look at the logical and physical infrastructure to see what can be done. So mapping the attack surface and any dependencies from the environment, and then decomposing and analysis. So each asset will have defined trust boundary that encompasses its components and the data in it, and mapping the threat vectors for a payment service and evaluating which components underlying the service can be leveraged for an attack. And components can be libraries, dependencies, modules, or any service that's attached. All of those things could be found during the decomposition analysis stage. And then you have the analysis of the threat. I can't believe I'm like mispronouncing these things. Threat analysis. So it's the looking at the extracted information from threat intelligence, and then used to identify which application is vulnerable and which vectors are used to attack it. So a customer or public-facing application can be susceptible to distributed denial of service and unauthorized data alteration, stuff like that. Then you have the vulnerabilities and weakness analysis, which looks at the web application's vulnerabilities and their security controls, and looks at, finds security flaws in the application, looks at the vulnerabilities and lists them, and it's highly recommended to add mitigation to the identified threat in this stage. So when you actually find out what the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses are, you try to list mitigations for it. So when you describe a past incident involving the exploit of a mail server, and then you learn some kind of lesson or mitigation from it, the thorough testing before implementation or hardening the server, all of these things could be examples that you found from previous analysis. And now if you found them, you add the mitigation immediately and you say, this is how we're going to fix this. And attack, exploit, enumeration, and modeling. We look at the possible threat landscape and the attack surface of the application. We then look at all the attack vectors and the different nodes that could be attacked, identifying the exploits that could be used, all the attack paths that could be taken, and it simulates all the enumerated information that's been extracted from all the previous steps, and it helps security professionals determine the extent and probability of successfully launching identified vulnerabilities, and lastly, the impact of the risk. So analyzing that based on the data from the previous stages, all the scoped assets that have been affected are analyzed, and finally, based upon risk analysis, recommended steps to mitigate the risk and eliminate all the residual risks, and then documenting all of those things during the last phase right here. So what threat modeling methodology assigns a rating system based on the probability of the risk. And so based on the probability of the risk, I think it's going to be the stride, right? I think it's dread. Yeah, it is dread. So the dread model right here tells us what can be done based on probability. So in other words, it creates a rating system that is scored based on risk probability. That's the dread model. What model methodology is built upon the CIA triad, and that is the first one that we were looking at, which is the stride model. Oops, there we go. And then what threat modeling methodology helps align technical requirements with the business objectives And this is the one, I believe, align technical requirements with business objectives is PASTA's goal right here. So PASTA. Every time I do this, I really crave pasta because I just keep saying pasta. So there we go. That was our threat modeling. So now let's look at secure coding. According to Verizon and research that they did in 2020, 43% of data breaches were on web applications, and everything else or some other security breaches resulted from vulnerabilities in the web applications. So there was attacks on the web applications and then vulnerabilities in the web applications. So looking at secure code review in the phases of secure software development lifecycle, especially during the implementation phase, will increase resilience and security of the product without bearing any additional cost for future patches. So secure code review is defined as a measure where the code itself is verified and validated to ensure probabilities. I mean, the name itself, just secure code review, kind of implies that we're going to be looking at the code itself. So it requires that you understand code at the very least, or you need to understand how to ask questions about the code. So it's important to just understand coding and finding out how you can mitigate and remove those vulnerabilities and flaws. So having the developers be aware and proactive in reviewing the code during development can result in faster mitigation responses and fewer unattended threats. Reviewing code is a crucial step for developers, and it prevents any setbacks on the release and issues exposed to the users. As shown in our previous task, the cost of the project itself and effort to put in are cheaper in the long run than the cost of applying code reviews and analysis. So by implementing this approach, the organization will also be compliant with the standards set by government bodies and certifications. It can either be done manually or automatically. Manual code review is where the expert analyzes the check and secure code by going line by line to identify vulnerabilities. And it's a high quality manual code review that requires the expert to communicate with the software developer to get hold of the purpose and functionalities of the application. And the analysis output will then be reported to the developers if there's anything for bug fixing. And then we have code analysis techniques, right? So static analysis examines the code without running it. Dynamic analysis looks at the code when the program is running. And static analysis detects bugs at the implementation level, and dynamic analysis detects errors during the program running. And automatic static application security testing, which is SAST, so static application security testing is SAST, automatically analyzes and checks the source code. So static application security testing, it's a white box testing method that directly analyzes the source code. White box means that you have everything that you need to know and you have permission to do it. And so you are essentially, analyzing the code. Many people tend to develop an application that could automate or execute processes quickly and improve performance and user experience, thereby forgetting the negative impact an application that lacks during that thing could cause. So why is it static? Because the test is done before an application is live and running. So you can help run all these things before the code is actually merged or integrated into the software and before you run it. So it's important to do this. It's important to do both, right? So you want to do static testing and then you want to do dynamic testing. So static testing uses a testing methodology of analyzing a source code to detect any traces of vulnerabilities that could provide a backdoor for an attacker, and usually analyzes and scans an application before the code is compiled. The process of SAST, static testing, is also known as white box testing, and once a vulnerability is detected, the line of action is to check the code and patch the code before the code is compiled and deployed. White box testing is an approach method that testers use to test the inner structure and how it integrates with external systems. Then you have a bonus, which is SCA right here. So software composition analysis is used to scan source code for vulnerabilities, which is SAST. And another type of testing that goes along with this is SCA, so software composition analysis. And it's used to scan dependencies for security vulnerabilities, meaning libraries that you would use or external tools that you would use and it helps the development team track and analyze any open source component that's been brought into the project. And it's now an essential pillar in security testing because modern applications are increasingly composed of open source code and code that you can get from GitHub, for example, right? So nowadays, one of the biggest challenges developer teams have is ensuring that their code base is secure as applications are assembled from different building blocks. Then we have dynamic application security testing, which is a black box testing method that finds vulnerabilities during runtime, and a tool to scan any web application to find security vulnerabilities, and it's used to detect vulnerabilities inside the application that has been deployed to production. So it's after it's actually been released and deployed and compiled, right? So DAST tools will always send alerts to the security team assigned for immediate remediation. And it works by simulating an automated attack on the application, mimicking the attacker. And the goal is to find unexpected outcomes or results that the attacker could use to compromise the application. And since these tools don't have internal information about the application or the source code, they just attack the same way that a hacker would, with the same limited knowledge and information, which is why they call it black box. So white boxes, you know everything. Black boxes, you don't know everything. And so you're just attacking everything that you possibly can. And DAST is a tool that can be integrated very early into the software development lifecycle. Its focus is to help organizations reduce and protect against the risk that the application could cause. It's very different from SAST because DAST uses black box and it conducts vulnerability assessments outside since it doesn't have access to the source code. And it's typically used during the testing phase of software development lifecycle. Then you have IAST, which is interactive, and it analyzes the code for security vulnerabilities while it's running. It's usually deployed side by side with the main application on the application server, and it's an application security tool designed for web and mobile applications to detect and report issues while running. Before somebody can fully comprehend the understanding, the person must know SAST and DAST. So IAST was developed to stop all the limitations in both SAST and DAST, and it uses gray box testing, which is a combination of white box and black box. And it's you both know and don't know, right? So you know everything, as well as meaning that the tool itself is looking at the source code as well as attacking it from the outside as if it doesn't know. And it occurs in real time while the application is running, and it can identify the line of code that is causing the security issues because it has access to the code, and it offers remediation. It checks the source code, but the post-build stage, like SAST, which occurs during development, but at the post-build stage, so it looks at the source code, but at the post-build stage, meaning it's already been compiled and it's being deployed. And agents, IAST agents, are typically deployed by the application server. When the DAST scanner performs its work by reporting vulnerability, the deployed IAST agent will now return a line number of the issue with the actual code itself. And the IAST agents on the application server can actually be deployed during functional testing by a quality assurance tester. The agent studies every pattern that the data transfer inside the application follows, regardless of whether or not it's dangerous. And if the data is coming from a user and the user wants to perform SQL injection by appending an SQL query to a request, the request will be flagged as dangerous. So RASP stands for Runtime Application Self-Protection, and it's integrated into the application to analyze inward and outward traffic and end-user behavior to prevent security attacks. And it's different from everything else because it's more security focused when compared to the other tools that are known for testing. So it's actually looking at security issues. And it's deployed to a web application next to the main application while running to monitor and analyze the inward and outward traffic immediately. If an issue is found, the alert is sent to the security team and immediately blocks access to whoever is making that request, essentially acting kind of like as an intrusion protection system almost. And when you deploy this, it'll secure the whole application against different attacks, and it does not just wait to try to rely on specific signatures of known vulnerabilities. It's a complete solution. So RASP is a complete solution that observes every detail of the different attacks and knows the application's behavior. When you want to choose a tool, it's complementary. So it's not like you just choose one thing. So DAST identifies runtime issues, right? SAST is identifying vulnerabilities while the code is being written. DAST looks at application responding to an attack, providing insight. AST enables DevSecOps and supports continuous testing, monitoring, assessment. IAST helps prioritize and alert the vital critical risks. And then all of these things, again, could just be compiled together. They could be complementary. They could be used, all of them. You don't have to just use one. That's kind of the big point here. It's like, I mean, there's no reason, there's nobody putting a rule in place saying that you just have to use one of these things. So if you were to look at it in the timeline of the development of the software, this is what you would do at the very, very beginning while you're developing the software. During the development phase, you would do SAST and SCA. And then during integration, you would do SCA. And then when you're going through acceptance, you would do SAST and DAST. So the static and dynamic while you're trying to finalize and accept the thing. And then before putting it into production and actually sending it out, you would do all of them. So static, dynamic, and integrated. And then finally you would do RASP, which is the runtime application. So during runtime, it does self-protection. So it's a good thing to kind of have an understanding of, that you would do static while it's being developed. You look at source code analysis while it's being developed. While you're being integrated, you look at source code analysis. While you're trying to accept whether or not this thing is actually going to be sent into compiling and production, you would now start doing dynamic analysis, and you run the code in a controlled environment, as well as static analysis. And then right before it actually goes into production and it's live and running, you would do all of them. You would do static, dynamic, and the combination of the two. And then finally, while it's actually running, you do runtime analysis. And none of these things are limited, right? So it's like you can use all of them. So here are our questions. So is it recommended to use SAST, static analysis, at the beginning of the lifecycle? And yes, it is recommended to use this at the beginning of the lifecycle. Which type of code analysis uses the black box method? And that would be dynamic, so DAST. And then which type of code analysis uses the white box method? And that is SAST, static analysis, because you get to actually see the source code and you see what you're attacking. So let's look at security assessments now. All right, so security assessment, as the name implies, is we're looking at potential security vulnerabilities of the software that's being deployed. And usually this is either a penetration test or some kind of a vulnerability assessment, or probably both, right? So a company employs and authorizes external security testers to attempt to break into a network and systems legally. So you give them permission to penetrate your systems. That's a pen test. And you typically hire a company or a person that really specializes in that. And that's actually what I'm trying to be. That's just super fun, in my opinion, to just get paid to attack somebody. It's the greatest thing ever. So the first thing, like the basic thing, is to just do a vulnerability assessment to find vulnerabilities. You don't validate them or try to attack them. Typically, you just look something, you use a tool like Nessus or something. OpenVAS is Open Vulnerability Assessment Scanner, Nessus, which is, I guess, has been renamed to Tenable. And then the ISS scanner. These are just scanners that attack your ports, or they don't attack your ports, they scan your ports and services on the system to just find vulnerabilities. And there are other things that can be done, which is service versions of something against the database of vulnerabilities. And the result is a report with a list of the vulnerabilities. And you have typically high, medium, low, which is quantitative, or an actual CVSS score. So Nessus actually does both. So it gives you high, medium, low quantitative, as well as the CVSS score, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System score. So 8.5 or something, you know what I mean? Penetration testing is where you actually attack the thing. So you do a vulnerability scan. As you're doing penetration testing, you'll do a vulnerability scan. And then once you have the vulnerabilities, you actually try to attack them and penetrate them. So trying to escalate privileges after a vulnerability is found. Some vulnerabilities can be lower risk and can be used to leverage to cause more damage. And the tester can provide a thorough report with suggested countermeasures to mitigate the vulnerabilities. And it makes it easier to just understand the perspective of the attacker, because that's literally the job of a pen tester, is to attack the system as if they were the hacker. So the pros and cons of the two are as such. So vulnerability assessments, it's quick identifying because you're just running a scanner. It's part of a pen test, so it's literally as if you were going to run the pen test. And if you're limited on a budget, you just run the pen test, like you just run a vulnerability scan and you have an idea of what's going on. What the con is that typically there's a big report that comes out of this thing, and it depends on the tool that you're using. So when you use an open source tool, you probably won't get as much as if you used a paid enterprise tool. Then the real life scenarios for those vulnerabilities aren't actually considered. So if it's a low risk vulnerability, so this is what we were talking about right here. So a vulnerability can be a lower risk vulnerability, but it can be used as leverage to cause more damage. And that's what the job of a pen tester is they look at the vulnerability and they're like, oh, this, I can kind of get my, dip my toe in the pool, so to speak, with this little vulnerability. But if I do, then I get access to these other vulnerabilities and I can actually attack the system. And a vulnerability scanner doesn't do that. A vulnerability assessment doesn't do that. They just show you, hey, this is kind of low risk or whatever. But the pen tester looks at that same vulnerability and is like, you know what I could do with this? I could do this, this, and this after I take advantage of this thing, and now I'm in their system, and now I'm doing some serious damage. So that's the pro of a pen test, right? So the tester shows organizations what an attacker can do. That's what a pen tester does. The vulnerabilities could be used against that organization by the attacker, the actual risk, right? With that little thing that you think is not a big deal, it can actually be leveraged by a pen tester. And then you can show all of the results that you got to the customer, but it can be expensive because you have to actually hire somebody to do this. And pen testers get paid a lot of money, buddy. Requires extensive planning and time to carry out. So it actually does take time to do it. And a lot of times pen testing, like a real big pen testing against a company, does physical pen tests as well as logical digital network pen tests, meaning like they'll try to actually get into your building. They'll send somebody to pose as, a honeypot or something. Like there's so many things that you can do to do a pen test. A really good show for this is Mr. Robot. If you haven't seen it, it actually has like very good examples of what a pen test would be and how you can attack an organization in a lot of different ways, social engineering attacks, everything. So they cover all the bases in Mr. Robot. Really great show. So now, which form of assessment is more budget friendly, which is the vulnerability assessment? And which type of assessment identifies vulnerabilities and attempts to exploit them, and that is a penetration test, or penetration testing, I guess. When do you typically carry out vulnerability assessments or pen tests? And we would do this during, let's see. So it says we would do it at the end of the software development lifecycle and the operations and maintenance phase. So let's see if that's actually the answer. And it is operation and maintenance is the phase. And just like that, we have looked at security assessment. So now let's look at security software development lifecycle methodologies. All right, before you do any of this stuff, you need to first build with security in mind, and you need to introduce testing focused on security, okay? So you need to test with focus on security, and you need to build with security in mind. If you are doing those things, if you have those two prerequisites, then you can look at the methodologies for the software development lifecycle, and then you can look at SSDL, which the first S stands for the secure software development lifecycle. So Microsoft Security Development Lifecycle has it's a methodology for SSDL. The OWASP Top 10, which were the last three videos actually. We did an overview of the OWASP Top 10, then we did API Security Parts 1 and 2. which should be live. By the time that you see this video, those two things will be live. They're already scheduled to come out. And then we have software security touchpoints. These are methodologies for SSDL, Secure Software Development Lifecycle. Microsoft SDL is secure by design, so it focuses on the whole software lifecycle by design, so from the very beginning. Security by default, software systems are constructed to minimize potential harm caused by attackers, meaning the software is deployed with the least necessary privilege, so trust no one, right? Secure in deployment, which means after you've actually, or while you're running it, it's accompanied by tools and guidance supporting users and administrators, and of course communication. So developers are prepared for occurring threats by communicating openly and timely with users and administrators. This is Microsoft's security development lifecycle. It's a collection of mandatory security activities that are grouped by traditional development lifecycle phases, and it's collected to assess training effectiveness, and metrics in the process are used to confirm the compliance of the process, post-release metrics for future changes, and there's a heavy emphasis on understanding the cause and effect of security vulnerabilities. And the development team must complete the mandatory security activities to comply with Microsoft's security development process. And you can implement this by these following practices, right? So I'm not going to read all of these details right here. You're more than welcome to pause this and read this, but you want to provide training, you want to define security requirements, define metrics and compliance reporting, perform threat modeling, establish design requirements, and define and use cryptography standards, which is encryption standards, and then manage the security risk of using third-party components. If you're using open source components, if you're using somebody else's code, even if you're buying the code and it's not open source, you just want to make sure that you understand what the vulnerability of those third-party components are as well. Use approved tools, perform security testing, which the stuff that we just talked about, perform security assessments like vulnerability assessments and pen testing, and establish a standard incident response process. So formal response process, just in case anything happens, what are you going to do? What's the series of steps you're going to take? Then we have the OWASP's Software Security Development Lifecycle. And it's a collection of mandatory security activities, again, by traditional software development phases. Data is collected, in-process metrics are used, post-release metrics are used. They place heavy emphasis on understanding the cause and effect, and a development team must complete the 16 mandatory security activities to comply with the Microsoft SDL process. So that's actually a part of OWASP's process as well. And this is what it looks like over here, where you have the high level of security analysis, security risk analysis, base training, and agreement and priority. So the project definition is all gate 1. And then you have the controls selection, which is the before you actually design, so the preliminary design, the initial design, so to speak. Then you have the security design review, where you're actually looking at the source code itself. You're doing the static analysis of the code. And then you have pen testing, which is once it's actually up and running and you're doing deployment, and you hire somebody to come and attack the software itself. And OWASP aims to build security quality gates to support quality and secure software made through the pipeline. And they actually use Microsoft security development as well as their own series of processes as well. So the main question that they're trying to answer is, how well are we doing? And where do we want to get to? So where are we at right now? And what's the goal? How secure do we want to be? And this is a great questions to ask. OWASP is a very big organization when it comes down to this specific process. So another critical security model is building security in maturity. And then it's a study of real-world software security and reflects the current state of software security. And it can be described as the measuring stick to understand your security posture by providing a comparison of other companies, and then you compare yourself to them. So it doesn't tell you what you should do, but rather what you're doing wrong. And there's hundreds of organizations that are actually involved in this, and we can go check it out here. So it's part of the OWASP process as well. So this is actually part of OWASP as well. So now, here are the questions here. So what methodology focuses follows a set of mandatory procedures embedded in SDLC, and it is Microsoft. What is it? SDL, SCL, or SDL? There you go. What maturity model helps you measure tailored risks facing your organization? What maturity model? Oh, interesting. All right, it's actually inside the paragraph that I skimmed over. So the maturity model, there's a couple in here. So we have OWASP's SAM, so Software Assurance Maturity Model, and that's the one that's actually used to tailor the organization's specific risks. So SAM is going to be the answer for this one. And then which one is used as a measuring stick? And this is the one that I actually did read, which is the BSIMM. So BSIMM is the measuring stick to determine the security posture, that they tell you what you're doing wrong, but not what you should actually do. And so now I think we actually get to do an actual exercise here. So we have the secure space lifecycle, where we're going to view a website and try to retrieve a flag. So let's go through this thing and have some fun. All right, here we go. So secure space lifecycle. We need you to help to get S2D2 out into space. The only way we can do this is by flying the rocket through the correct security stage portals of the software development lifecycle. Use the left and right cursor keys to move your spaceship. I get to play a game. This is cool. Okay, so let's see. Where I kind of want to zoom in. I feel like I should. But let's see if... oh no. Oh no. Wait. No. Damn it. I forgot. I'm trying to get settled here, man. Okay, all right, so the first one. What security procedure would you choose for the planning and requirements stage? Okay, so we're going to use the left and right arrows. No. Okay. What security procedure would you choose for the design and prototyping stage? Prototyping design would be threat. No? All right, here we go. I feel like this is the one. This is the one. We're going to win this one. This is the one. Okay. First one, planning and requirement, you do risk assessment or risk management. And then what would you do during design and prototyping? You would do threat modeling during design and prototyping. And then what would you do software testing? The first step of software testing is going to be SAST. Okay. And then the second part of software testing, so SAST was static, which is the first part. The second one is DAST, which is dynamic. And then the third part of the software testing is going to be the code review itself. Okay. And then we're going to do the first part of developing operations and maintenance, which is going to be the security configurations, so security config. And then the second part of this would be the assessment, security assessment. That's it. Oh, okay, thank God. And that was the last question. My God, I did that so many times. That's so fucking crazy. Okay, so there we go. Do a barrel roll. Let's see if this actually copy paste for us. There we go. Do a barrel roll. That's it. And we got it, ladies and gentlemen. That was that was so annoying. No, but we won. I mean, we won the game. At least they made it a game, so it was kind of fun. Now I noticed this guy right here, freaking Chewie. Now I know why this thing was here the whole time. Or, you know, they can't use Chewie Star Wars, so they had somebody that kind of looks like Chewie. Anyways, that was it for Secure Software Development Life Cycle. And we can move on to our next video for the next one, which is going to, we're actually making some pretty good progress here, which is SAST for static application security testing. And then we have dynamic application security testing, weaponizing vulnerabilities, so on and so forth. So we're making good progress here, but that was it for Secure Software Development Lifecycle. Alright, if you got any value from this video, or if you want to get more videos like this one, make sure that you like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell so that you get notified the next time that a video comes out. We are currently on 140 videos, and it's going to keep going. I'm telling you, there's videos already that have been scheduled to publish, and we're just going to keep going and going and going. So if you found any value from this, I do invite you to join our community, and I do respond to all the comments, so make sure you drop all your questions in the comments. We would love to see you in the comments. And yeah, it would just be really awesome to have you as a part of the community.